Secretary Wright, I can't express thanks enough. I know how busy and sort of scary today in many ways has been. The oil markets are reacting in a positive way. Oil is falling. What message, and you're a former oil and gas executive at Liberty Energy, what do you think the oil markets are trying to say right now?
Look, I think a strong, confident, calm America is just a stabilizing force, both geopolitically and in the energy world. I think when people see where America stands, that President Trump's agenda of peace through strength, I think people realize things in the Middle East will eventually de-escalate and will be in a place of a much safer, a much more stable Middle East and world as a whole.
Are you surprised that oil is down 6% right now, Secretary Wright?
No. I mean, I would not expect much movement of oil upwards from the tensions that are going on. We've seen a little bit in the run-up, but when it's clear where America stands, I'm not surprised that oil prices are moved down a little bit. They've moved down maybe more than I would have guessed. But no, I think we're in such a good position today. This American energy dominance that President Trump ran on, we're at record high production of oil today, record high production of natural gas. We've got friendly, close communication relationships with our other major energy-producing nations, and we're standing strong against the one and only one major destabilizing force in the Middle East. The Biden policy of appeasing Iran and begging them not to harm us obviously was a provocation to Iran and showed a weak, irresolute America. A strong, confident America is a force for stability.
You just brought up something that Halima Croft, who's joining us again, by the way, right now, and I were talking about in the past hour, which was this idea that Iran's kind of on an island. They're actually the rotating president of OPEC and its allies this year. There's a huge meeting coming up in a couple of days in Vienna, Austria. Everybody that you just referenced will be in the same room, literally talking. Maybe you will be there, Secretary Wright. If you could break some news for us, we'd appreciate that. But if not, can you tell our viewers, is there are you on the horn with the Saudis? Are you speaking with the Emiratis? Is Iran increasingly isolated, even in its oil and geographic and geopolitical world?
Yeah, certainly. I'm in close contact and have been all weekend with our close allies over there. And look, what do they want? They want the same thing the U.S. wants. They want the same thing Israel wants, a peace. They want commerce, not instability. That's what everybody wants. The Middle East is poised to thrive, if not for the poison of Iran, through all of its proxy throughout the Middle East and directly from Iran. And I think you see some bubbling confidence that this 46 years of chaos and threat to the United States that Iran brought, that may be coming to an end. We may see a different era, an era of peace and prosperity and commerce as the dominating force in the Middle East. That's what everyone wants. I think that's where we're headed.
Secretary Wright, yesterday I was on the phone all day with high-level insurance sources who said, one after the other, their primary concern is the Strait of Hormuz remaining open because the disruption in trade routes has trickle-down effects, even for companies that don't have direct exposure to the Persian Gulf or to Iran directly. And many companies don't because of the sanctions that have been in place for so long. Can you give us some insight into how the U.S. military is thinking about the Strait of Hormuz and keeping it safe and open?
Yeah, of course, it is a key waterway for the movement of oil and for natural gas. It's important to the world. But look, all of Iran's exports and all of its imports come through the Strait of Hormuz. So that's kind of like spiting their face.
Are you saying that you don't think that there's very much cause for concern over mining or closing the strait?
Oh, there's certainly the risk of that. As Iran has been humbled and as Iran has realized they stand alone against the rest of the world that wants peace and trade, you don't know what Iran's going to do in the coming days. So there's some risk of that, but I don't think the risk is huge. The only way Iran gets revenue is to ship its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. If they close the Strait of Hormuz, it's not others they hurt, it's themselves.
Yeah, and the Strait of Hormuz has never been closed. I mean, it's hard to believe that. Even during the Gulf War in 1990 and 91, Secretary, the Strait was not closed, even as missiles literally were flying. The president today, sort of social mediating on True Social, coming out and saying we want to drill, baby, drill. We want to add to U.S. oil production. The United States, to your point at the top, is already at a record high, about 13.5 million barrels per day. Is there? Do you know? Is there any way to get the U.S. to produce more oil? Because ultimately, that's going to come down to the Exxons and the Chevrons and the Occidentals of the world, not the U.S. government.
Exactly. You know, we've got the price signals of the market that drive investment decision. But, Brian, you give that 13.5 million barrels, that's U.S. crude oil. The 100 million barrels a day you hear global oil market, that's liquid fuels. That's crude oil, that's natural gas liquids, that's ethanol, that's refinery gain. When you add in natural gas liquids, the U.S. is 20 million barrels a day. When you add in ethanol and refinery gain, we're above that. So we're over 20% of U.S. production today. And what's growing the most rapidly in the U.S. is natural gas and natural gas liquids. Because as we open up more export markets, they ease the ability to build pipelines and export terminals, we can produce more natural gas. Our crude production's continuing to grow this year, half of that from the Gulf of Mexico, half of that onshore. And so, yeah, I feel quite good about where U.S. production stands right now. And more importantly, the investment climate for the companies you mentioned and all the producers in the United States. We want a safe, simple, sensible regulatory environment that allows them to make long-term investment decisions.
We are lucky to have with us Halima Croft of RBC Capital Markets as well. And as you know, probably know Secretary Wright, she goes to more OPEC meetings than anybody out there in the world. So, Halima, you're here. You've got the Secretary of Energy here. You represent RBC Capital Markets. What would be the Wall Street view for the Energy Secretary?
Well, I think that the interesting question I would have for the Energy Secretary is there was a fantastic meeting that was held last week. You mentioned dialogue with OPEC members. Secretary Wright was with, a big Emirati delegation where they were talking about partnership with investment coming from the Gulf into the United States, the importance of U.S. natural gas for AI. So I would love to hear more about this partnership. And he talked about the need for stability in the Middle East. How important is it to the U.S. Gulf partnership around energy, around AI?
Secretary Wright?
It's important because, look, our major allies in the Middle East, Halima, as you know well, are generating just huge amounts of cash. They want to profitably invest that. And there's just simply nowhere better to put capital than the United States. We have a huge build-out for AI infrastructure going on. And as you mentioned, the UAE was here. They're major investors in that infrastructure here in the United States. They're also investing in U.S. energy infrastructure, natural gas export terminals. And if you saw their announcement for a purchase of Santos, what's the biggest driver behind that? Simply the huge upside in Alaskan oil production. So, yes, I think these cross investments, U.S. investment in the United Arab Emirates, UAE investment in the United States, same thing for Saudi, same thing for Qatar, same thing for Kuwait. This is the kind of Middle East we want going forward. And I think there's been one obstacle to that, Iran. And I think that one obstacle is going to shrink and fade away.
Well, China is still importing a lot of oil from Iran. And I'm thinking about this. If the price of oil goes up for China, then the price of manufacturing goods goes up, the price of shipping goes up, and ultimately, tariffs aside, the cost of goods for Americans goes up. Can you give us any insight into the role China is currently playing in these tensions and the escalating situation in the Middle East?
Yeah, look, I certainly won't share any intelligence or anything there. But yeah, look, China is the taker of virtually all of Iran's exported oil. Does China want the Strait of Hormuz closed or high oil prices? Absolutely not. But they are the main customer, almost the entire customer for Iran's oil. And you mentioned energy prices. Yeah, of course they matter. The crazy thing is, here we sit today, oil prices are more than 10% lower today than they were 12 months ago. And yet we've got we're in the middle of major conflict in the Middle East. Only President Trump could bring an energy situation where we can have lower oil prices than we had a year ago in the midst of a major conflict, and likely headed lower after this conflict gets resolved.
On a separate note, and this is not related to the Middle East, but I have to ask you about it, Chris, because we're seeing a heat wave across half the United States, and it's spectacularly hot, and there is a real risk for the grid. And recently, you and your team ordered, I think, the oldest power plant in the United States to continue. It's called Eddystone. It's outside of Philadelphia. I think it was built when we used stone tools. It's that old, but you ordered it still open to stay open because it provides this sort of peaker, this key power toward the end. Can the U.S. energy grid sustain the kind of heat that we're having right now? I know it's off topic compared to the Middle East, but let's be clear. Tomorrow, the next day, it's still going to be hot. And this is a lot on the minds of a lot of people, maybe even more than what's happening in Iran.
Oh, Brian, you're so right. And yeah, of course, I took some heat from the suspects you would expect for issuing a 202C order to keep that plant open. You know, that was just a few weeks ago. That plant is running today. When you have peak demand, you simply have to keep a capacity you have that's viable and running. I did the same thing with a coal plant in southwestern Michigan that was slated to close 15 years before its end of life. And sure enough, 2 days later in MISO, in the Midwest independent system operator, they had a blackout 2 days later. So we need to stop digging the hole, keep working power plants open today, and do everything we can on the regulatory framework to allow new capacity to be added to our grid so we can lead in the AI race. That's what we're going to do. But it is a meaningful pivot.
Because we're close.
4 years.
Secretary Wright, you know this. And this is an issue for a lot of Americans, just like the Middle East. We are so close sometimes. And the grid operator in the Mid-Atlantic area, 60 million households are under what they call PJM. Like a year ago, they issued this Friday night report, really kind of a late on a Friday night. Oh, we may not have enough power to keep the grid going. This is scary when we need air conditioning to stay cool. It's dangerously hot.
For 4 years, the Biden administration dug a hole trying to stand in the way of energy development and forcing the closure of so many coal plants. So we can't reverse that overnight, but we've at least reversed the trajectory overnight. We're stopping the closure of viable coal plants today, and we're doing everything we can to enable the rapid build-out of new energy generation systems.
Yeah.
You're right. Americans depend on air conditioning and lights and the incubators in the hospitals working. You can't draw politics and make stupid decisions about energy. We suffered 4 years of that, and I think that's why President Trump won election.
Chris Wright, Secretary of Energy. Secretary Wright, probably keep you on all hour, but I know you've got a lot more to do. We do appreciate your time very, very greatly today. The world's on edge. Oil price is actually down. But thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thanks, Brian, Contessa, and Halima.